And thanks to Alicia and to Dirk for this invitation. My name's Michael Karanicolas. I'm the executive director. Oh, hang on. How do I advance this? Is this working? There it is. I'm the executive director of the Institute for Technology Law and Policy here at UCLA. And as of January 1, I'm an associate professor of law and the James Palmer Chair in Law and Public Policy at Dalhousie University. I'll be focusing in this talk on content and governance questions related to decentralization, particularly from the perspective of trying to foster a robust and democratic information society. And I want to start with a brief history of digital speech and content governance. I won't start quite from the beginning because I've only really been engaged in this space from a policy perspective since 2011 or so. But my introduction to this space came when I was 6 years old, and my family got a Commodore 64. And I remember sitting with my older brothers and then showing me how this thing could talk to other computers. And so we were there, using this thing to communicate, around the country, around the world, to other kids. I say other kids. I have no idea if they were actually kids. They might have been adults. It was a different time. But we were in this pretty tightly controlled house, and all of a sudden there we were sharing dirty jokes and sending like 8-bit pixel art back and forth. There was a kind of freedom there, and I don't want to be pretentious and say that I recognized then I wanted to do tech policy. But even in my little 6-year-old brain, I did understand that there was something subversive there. And I want to fast forward us through a lot of the early development in the space, the rise of messaging boards, but I do want to pause at 1994, and I want to tell a brief story about this guy. So that gentleman's name is Jordan Belfort, and you're probably more familiar with him through his depiction. Well, either you're a tech policy person, in which case you know him, or you're more familiar with him through his depiction here. Because this guy, him and his firm, Stratton Oakmont, had an enormous influence on why online content moderation works the way that it does. And it starts with this company called Prodigy. Now, Prodigy, through the early 90s, offered networking services, and it marketed itself as being the family-friendly version of the internet, right? They were going to keep you safe from all the filth that you're going to get over from companies like CompuServe. They're going to control the speech that they host so that the harmful material is removed and the online experience that you get is more safe and family friendly. And in October 1994, somebody posted that Stratton Oakmont was committing criminal fraud on a massive scale. And Stratton Oakmont, some folks associated with the company, sued them for defamation. They sued Prodigy, they sued the company. And this was a problem because there's a common law principle that holds that the more control you have over speech that you host, the more responsible you are for that speech, especially bad things that happen as a result of that speech. So if the New York Times prints a false story about a person being a con artist, they can be sued for defamation because they have this editorial process over the content. But of course, if UPS, if I write a letter about a person being a con artist and I send it to a bunch of people via UPS, I'm still responsible, but UPS is not responsible because they have no editorial control. They're not intervening in the content of the messages, right? And the court in that case ruled that because Prodigy was offering this curated, family-friendly version of the internet, because they were taking more responsibility to try to edit out harmful stuff, they assumed more liability. And as a result of that, internet companies had two choices. You can either moderate nothing and be like UPS or be like AT&T and say, look, we're just sending messages back and forth. We take no responsibility for anything. Or they can be the New York Times and moderate everything and have an editorial process and moderate it very, very strictly. And of course, because it's very costly and risky to take that New York Times approach, the incentive would be for companies to either avoid curating speech altogether or get out of the business entirely, just don't host user-generated messages. So that was the choice that internet companies were left with as a result of this case. And this was happening at the same time as there was a broader moral panic going on through the early 90s related to the availability of pornography on the internet. And in 1996, as a result of that kind of broader moral panic that was happening, Congress passed the Communications Decency Act, whose overarching purpose was to prohibit the distribution of obscene or indecent materials via the internet. And that is why, since 1996, there's been no pornography available on the internet. Just kidding. So the law was immediately challenged by the ACLU on First Amendment grounds, and it was struck down, except for one part of the law, and that was Section 230. And Section 230 was designed to provide certain immunities from liability for online platforms, online service providers, for content generated by their users. And its purpose in the context of the Communications Decency Act was to remove this disincentive that existed as a result of this case, remove the disincentive for companies like Prodigy from doing responsible content moderation. And Section 230 is what allowed for the rise of social media platforms hosting user-generated content at scale, because it allowed for the development of this Goldilocks zone of content moderation, where companies no longer have to choose between either doing nothing or being incredibly strict. So this law, plus network effects and a lack of robust interoperability, is what caused over the next couple decades what we can think about as the great re-centralization of online communications. This area where open communicate, and it's relevant because the core impact of widespread household internet access on the public discourse was a decentralization of that discourse away from traditional hubs of information, newspapers, state broadcasters, government agencies. The power of these elite speakers was eroded as a result of the popularization of internet access. And we started to get new hubs emerging that were outside of the control of these governments. And when you get everybody together onto this communications hub that's outside of the control of any kind of government, and you do that particularly in an autocratic context, incredible things can happen, right? And this is where I entered the policy space. I graduated law school in 2011, and I started working in an international human rights organization right as this thing was unfolding. And it was peak tech optimism. And we were working in Tunisia, we were working in Egypt, we were working in these post-revolutionary societies, and democracy was on the march all over the world. It was incredible, right? All thanks to Facebook, all thanks to Twitter. Twitter is liberating the world. And you can read my writing at the time, and it was blindly optimistic about the impact of tech on human rights and democracy. And then from 2013 onwards, my biggest project with that organization was in Myanmar. And Myanmar at the time was undergoing its own democratization, right? From 2013 to 2017, I was working on the ground there. And so I got a front row seat to the whole slow-moving car crash that was Facebook's involvement in that country. And as a result, partly of this, but as a result of broader forces in this space, there was mounting pressure on platforms right around this time to do more in terms of content moderation, right? There was pressure from governments, there was pressure from advertisers, there was pressure from employees, from tech workers, and there was pressure from their own users to do more, to take responsibility for the content that they were hosting. And as a result, throughout the 2010s, there is this enormous expansion of content moderation, exemplified by the emergence of trust and safety as its own standalone field. And there were significant developments as a result, significant development in the understandings of what responsible moderation looks like. And that's natural because, of course, you have a lot of smart people that are being paid to think about this stuff. And they weren't always listened to within the company structures that they were in. But the field advanced tremendously. But then throughout the 2010s, as platform power and influence became more obvious, there were increasingly aggressive demands from governments for platforms to do more to police user content. And that didn't start in the 2010s. You can go back to 2006 and 2007 and find complaints from the Thai police going to Google, that Google needed to take down videos that were insulting the king. There were complaints from the Turkish government about taking down videos that were insulting to Ataturk. So this didn't start in the 2010s, but there was a huge escalation at that time period, partly related to the application of traditional content laws in the digital space, right? And some of this stuff is uncontroversial. Most people don't bat an eye when Facebook or Google announces new measures to crack down on the trade in child sexual abuse material. But a lot of it was much more controversial, where, for example, you have pressure to crack down on legal speech through informal requests. All across the EU, governments started standing up these internet referral units, whose reason for being was to send notices to tech platforms about legal speech and telling them this speech is legal, but we suspect that it violates your own terms of service against, say, terrorist speech or some sort of what Daphne Keller calls lawful but awful content, and not ordering the companies to take it down, but politely suggesting that the companies should take it down. Again, these are police agencies targeting legal speech. And I just want to break for a moment to say, for those of you that were following the stuff that was coming out through the so-called Twitter files and Hunter Biden's laptop, and oh my God, governments are asking platforms to take stuff down. This has been going on for 10 years. And I do want to emphasize that, because that often gets lost in the narrative about what was happening over the last couple of years with COVID. Because this has been a long-standing problem, and it's problematic. But again, it didn't start a couple of years ago. But there was a major escalation in attitudes towards moderation within these companies from about 2015 to 2020. And you can isolate three major causes of that. The first was the 2016 presidential election and escalating concerns about election interference. You could also point to Brexit as spurring part of the conversation in this space, but realistically, the platforms are overwhelmingly concerned with the US and the 2016 election and the discussions around election interference were cause number one. Cause number two was the COVID pandemic and concerns about health misinformation, which also saw a flood of new problematic laws around the world targeting health misinformation, which were almost universally abused in order to target anti-corruption research and legitimate journalism. And the third main trigger for this was the insurrection in 2020, which itself led to a temporary crackdown on election misinformation and more aggressive deplatforming. So these existing models of content governance, all of them evolved in the platform era, and all of them are predicated on a centralized discourse. I'm going to say not all of this stuff is bad. Not all of these activities are bad. I don't know how libertarian or anarchist an audience I'm talking to, but I would argue in a public health emergency, these kinds of information governance structures that support particular narratives about vaccines, about prevention, there's real value to that. Likewise, going back to the example of Myanmar, beyond Facebook's original sin of charging into that country and scooping up as much user base as they could without knowing anything about the culture, that was the original sin of their involvement. But at the end of the day, what they did wrong in that country was a failure to effectively moderate their network. And you get similar challenges to this day on WhatsApp, compounded by technical challenges of moderating encrypted information. So while it's tempting to look at moderation being done badly and the justified mistrust in a lot of the leadership at these tech companies, I don't think the answer is to say, let's get rid of it all, because I think there's a huge amount of value to the moderation and a need for moderation that takes place. At the same time, the fact that you have the discourse concentrated among a handful of companies, these choke points, makes it very convenient for governments in the US or in the UK or in India or in Azerbaijan to suppress speech that they find inconvenient. So there are concerns, there are huge challenges with the way that speech has been concentrated on a few different networks. But I think that a return to the Wild West days is dangerous, especially now that we've seen the way that harms can manifest in the absence of effective governance. So we've seen this growing and justified mistrust over the power of tech companies, especially over the online discourse. And that's completely natural. It is natural to be suspicious of any kind of unaccountable power structures. But it's also, I think, driven, at least recently, by these companies' growing flirtation with authoritarian forces. And that's true both here in the US and it's true around the world. And this is particularly salient because if you think back to the days of the social media revolutions, civil society and the protesters on the street enjoyed a kind of a first mover advantage back then, where the information discourse, the information environment had changed and governments didn't understand it, but the people on the street did. And they had a bit of that, kind of first mover advantage that allowed these authoritarian regimes to be caught flat-footed. And today's structure of centralized digital governance will not be allowed to push back against institutional or autocratic forces the way that it did in the early 2010s. And partly that's because governments have wised up. They've seen this happen once. They're not going to get caught again. Partly it's because these companies are now very firmly on the side of those in power. They are not the disruptors. They are the Leviathan. And I think all of these factors together, the lack of accountability, the fact that we see tech companies, not to say switching sides, but increasingly on the side of the folks that are of the autocratic forces, has led to this hunger for decentralization. And so we've seen this flood of new users to Mastodon, to Blue Sky. Project Liberty is talking about buying TikTok. I talk about that later. But even Facebook with Threads is trying to hedge their bets on a decentralized world. There's more interest in this space, I think, now than there's been in maybe a generation. At the same time, as people move into these spaces, the same challenges are starting to emerge, the exact same challenges we saw in every previous iteration. And in a lot of ways, they're more difficult to deal with in this kind of in a decentralized context for several reasons. For one thing, effective content moderation is really expensive, and it is resistant to scaling up. It's particularly difficult to do content moderation where you're managing a multitude of different languages and cultural contexts. Closed platforms tend to be more easily monetized, right? And as a result of that, the financial model underlying federated systems still needs to be clarified. There's a lot of unanswered questions. I asked this, actually, we had Tamika Tillman speak at the Institute of Technology and Policy a few months ago. He's the CEO of Project Liberty, which is angling to buy TikTok and apparently turn it into a decentralized structure. And I sort of asked him, well, the thing about that bid that I was puzzled about was they want to make it decentralized. They're insisting it's not going to be surveillance driven. So they're basically tearing down the monetization structure that currently exists. but they're making a play for it, which is backed by all these banks, right? Because they need outside investment in order to pony up the, whatever it is, $200 billion that they're going to need to pay for it. So how do you get outside investors to buy this asset while also promising to destroy its avenue of making money, its revenue? And I didn't quite get a proper answer to that, but also, I mean, it is, well, what you said at the time, I think you said, like, look, a lot of this stuff is happening behind closed doors and they can't get ahead of it. And that's fair enough, but that's something that I haven't understood. And it illustrates the challenges around monetization. So the point that I want to make is that, and it's also worth noting, there are reams of legislation which have been written on the understanding that platforms are these closed systems which need to be reconsidered for an open and decentralized context. Previous to my time at UCLA, I was the Wikimedia Fellow and worked a lot with that organization. And a huge part of their policy work is going to regulators around the world who design laws based on the Facebook model and think they're only regulating Facebook. And they need to say, hey, we're Wikimedia, your laws would apply to us and it would absolutely destroy us because we're not the same as Facebook. So quite often they get a little exception carved out some way for Wikimedia. But the point is these laws very often are structured in a way on the assumption that scale translates to particular levels of revenue. And all that stuff needs to be reconsidered for a decentralized context. You need to think about privacy and data protection legislation, how that's going to apply in a decentralized context. You need to think about process and reporting rules, as in the DSA. Some of the reporting stuff is relatively easy. A lot of it isn't. And the other thing that I want to note as things move to a more decentralized structure, or as there's more interest and more users move to decentralized platforms, is that governments are eventually going to start paying attention to this space, and they're going to be making the same demands that they did of traditional platforms, often backed by threats of force. And that brings me back to my entry point into this space, where it's easy to romanticize this era, but there is no going back. You know, I think a libertarian system is fine in an era of kind of niche communications where kids are sending each other dirty jokes. But if this is the central information hub for our democracy, you need more. Democratic civil societies have always required some mechanisms for information governance. It doesn't need to be top down, but you need to have something there. Laws need to be enforced, norms need to be set and applied. And while it's clear that Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are not the ones to get us there, it is also true that closed platforms have a number of benefits that are not easily replicated by open models, and that's a challenge. It's also true that top-down centralized governance is a lot cleaner and easier, right? Ask anybody who's ever tried to engage in a consensus-driven decision-making ecosystem. It's not impossible. It's not impossible, right? But it's more difficult. And while decentralized systems are, I think, in their honeymoon period at the moment, a reckoning with user and government expectations is going to come. And I think that leaves us with three different options. The first is, well, you change the expectations. Change the expectations that governments have about how moderation is going to work. Change the expectations that users have. I don't think that's tenable. Pakistan and China have both blocked Blue Sky already. The US and Canadian governments are cracking down on TikTok. Accommodations are going to need to be found, and governance is going to be necessary. So I think that that's not tenable from a legal and policy perspective. And I also think it's just not advisable, because I do think that the harms that are manifesting in the information space require governance mechanisms to address. The second option is to lean into the technology and develop effective automated moderation structures. I am also deeply skeptical of this solution because a lot of people have already thrown a lot of money at this problem without much progress, right? There's a reason why Meta still employs 80,000 moderators. And it's not because Mark Zuckerberg just enjoys forcing airplane hangars full of people to sit there on 12-hour shifts and watch beheading videos. I don't think that's why they have the moderators. They have them there because they can't automate. And if a company with a level of resource, essentially infinite money, the way Meta does, can't automate this stuff, I think it's going to be a real challenge. People have suggested middleware as some kind of an option where you have standalone content moderation services. It's an interesting idea, but again, it comes down to this idea. It comes down to it doesn't solve the question of who pays for this stuff. And I also think there's a question of norm setting at the core of a lot of this, where we need to ask whose rules or values are we enforcing? A lot of the answers right now, if you look at current decentralized platforms, rely on individualizing and allowing greater customization as the answer. And while natural interoperability does make it easier for users to vote with their feet, which does make decision-making more inherently democratic, democracy and a lack of platform accountability is not the only issue. For years, platforms were rightly criticized for incentivizing engagement above all other metrics, right? But in doing so, they were just giving people what they wanted, right? They were giving people what they wanted, what they were clicking on, regardless of whether it was bad for them, regardless of whether it was bad for society. If that's your benchmark for criticizing them, democratization and letting the market speak does not solve that problem. The market has already spoken in that sense. And that sort of brings me back to the title of this talk. Now, I'm not an expert in American history. I'm also not American. Most of my understanding of America's early history comes from watching Hamilton. But a lot of that story seems to have been driven by dissatisfaction with an overbearing, unaccountable, and arbitrary governance structure, which led the protagonist to aim for a new and better form of government. And I wouldn't go as far as to say we need a declaration of the independence for cyberspace, because that has been tried. But the people that are building these new architectures need to engage with the difficult policy questions that are underlying. And the design decisions that are being made need to be taken in a way that engages with fundamental questions about the kind of norms and rules that are not only what the users want, but which are best for an informed and democratic society, and to grapple with the difficult trade-offs that exist and underlie a lot of these design decisions. What we need is a process to hash these questions out, and that is something that I don't think really exists at the moment. I'm not talking about something that's necessarily universal, but I do think that an individualized structure which relies on the wisdom of the crowd is insufficient and will be unable to push back against government and private sector demands to co-opt this space when they inevitably arise. So as we think about the designers, the people running companies in this space, there is a need to plan a marker down in support of competing visions of online governance and a process for setting and applying norms in a way that is structural and semi-formalized, and that provides a basis for collective and accountable decision-making. And I want to emphasize that because right now, it seems like there's a whole lot of muddling through going on, where the attitude is, we'll figure this stuff out as it comes up. And that's the attitude, I think, that got us into this mess in the first place. So I don't know who Lin-Manuel Miranda is in this story. Maybe it's Lin-Manuel Miranda. You could make an entrance in the tech space. But we do need intentionality, and we need governance to inform design in a way that builds resiliency against the malevolent actors that are likely to come knocking as this thing continues to grow. Thanks.